Hi to everyone. Lecture 3 in thorax anatomy. We will continue. The objectives of our lecture first is to describe the anatomy of diaphragm, the shape, the blood supply, innervation and functions. Second, the anatomy of the mediastinum and contents. Third is you should be able to describe the anatomy, relations, innervation, and the blood supply of the trachea. So we first start with the diaphragm. The diaphragm is thin, muscular, and tendinous septum. It is a septum. It has a dome shape. It separates the chest cavity from the abdominal cavity. It is muscular and tendinous. It means that it consists of muscular part and tendinous part. It plays very important role in the process of respiration. It consists of peripheral muscular part and central part. The origin of diaphragm can be divided into three parts. First, sternal part, which arises from the posterior surface of the xiphoid process. يعني الdiaphragm, the origin of the diaphragm is not from one region or single region, no. The origin from three different parts, sternal, costal, vertebral, all these, they give origin to the diaphragm. So from the sternal part, from the name, so it arises from the posterior surface of the xiphoid process. As you know, the xiphoid process is the third part of the sternum. The second part is the costal part, which arises from the deep surface of the lower 6 ribs, of course with their costal cartilage. So costal, as we said in the last lecture, costal, it means ribs. So the costal part, that it arises from the deep surfaces, inner surfaces or deep surfaces from the lower 6 ribs with their costal cartilages. The vertebral part, it arises by vertical columns or crura and from the arcuate ligaments. So how is that? In this slide, the diaphragm, it means that the diaphragm has right crus and left crus. The diaphragm has right and left crus. The right crus, it arises from the sides of the bodies of the upper 3 lumbar vertebrae, of course with their intervertebral disc. The left crus, it arises from the sides of the body of the upper 2 lumbar vertebrae with their intervertebral disc. Just like this figure. So the right side, the right crus arises from the upper 3 lumbar vertebrae, the left from the upper 2 lumbar vertebrae with their intervertebral disc. Lateral to the crura, lateral to the right crus and left crus, the diaphragm arises from the medial and lateral arcuate ligaments. So this is the medial arcuate ligament here, and lateral to it is the lateral arcuate ligaments. So the part of the diaphragm that is lateral to the right and left crura arises from or take their origin from medial and lateral arcuate ligaments. Right and left crura, they are connected together by the median arcuate ligament. So the median arcuate ligament connected the two crura with each other. The diaphragm is inserted into central tendon. So this is the origin. Okay, but the insertion is in the central tendon. As you see, this white region, it has this shape of imagine that if you look to the diaphragm from the lower side, from the side of the abdomen, you will see this figure. So this white shape central tendon. It refers to the central tendon. It has the shape of 3 leaves. So in this region, some fibers from the right cross of the diaphragm, they cross up to the left, surrounding the esophageal orifice, forming a sling-like loop. This is the esophageal sphincter. So this crossing will form the esophageal sphincter. The shape of the diaphragm. If you look to the diaphragm from in front, if you look at the diaphragm anteriorly or from front, the diaphragm, it curves up to the right and left domes, right? So the right dome, it reaches to the upper border of the 5th rib, while the left one to the lower border of the 5th rib. So the right side is higher than the left one. Why? This is because of the right lobe of the liver. The location of the central tendon, which is, as we said, the insertion of the diaphragm into the central tendon, it is at the xivisternal joint. So the dome, what are they doing? The domes, they support the lungs. The right dome supporting the right lung, the left dome supporting the left lung. But the central tendon, which is centrally located, it supports the heart. So there is something important, that the levels of the diaphragm, they vary according to the phase of respiration, according to the posture, sitting, standing, lying flat, the degree even of distension of the abdominal viscera. All of these are playing a role in changing the level of the diaphragm. So it is not, so the diaphragm, for example, it is lower when the person is sitting or standing, but when the person is lying flat, it is higher. When the person having large meal, it becomes higher, right? So this shape, if you look to the diaphragm from front, so if you look to the diaphragm from the side, the diaphragm has the shape or appearance of inverted J. And how is that? Because the long limb, it will extend from the vertebral column, because as you know, it has a vertebral origin. And the short limb, it extends from the xiphoid process because it has a sternal origin. The nerve supply, how's the innervation of the diaphragm? It has motor and sensory innervation. The motor of the diaphragm is always from the phrenic nerve. Right phrenic nerve, left phrenic nerve, which originated from C3, C4, C5, they give motor innervation to the diaphragm. The sensory innervation, the central region of the diaphragm, I mean the parietal pleura that cover the diaphragm, the central part, cover the central part of the diaphragm, and the peritoneum from the lower down, peritoneum from the abdominal side. The peritoneum that lining the diaphragm, I mean from the central part, these take their sensory innervation from the phrenic nerve, but the peripheral to that, or the peripheral part of the diaphragm, is innervated or receive its sensory innervation from the lower 6 intercostal nerves. So the central part innervation is different from the peripheral part. What about the blood supply? The blood supply of the diaphragm, it takes branches from the internal thoracic arteries, which are the pericardiophrenik artery and musculophrenic arteries from the internal thoracic arteries. The word phrenic, when it is phrenic, it means diaphragm. Innervation or blood supply. Phrenic, it means it supply the diaphragm. So pericardiophrenik artery and musculophrenic artery branches from internal thoracic artery, they give a blood supply, they supply the diaphragm, in addition to the superior phrenic artery and inferior phrenic arteries that arises from the aorta. What about the openings? This is very important. Actually, in the diaphragm, there are three main openings. The caval opening, second is the esophageal opening, and aortic opening. The caval opening, this is the higher one. It is at the level of the 8th thoracic vertebra. It is on the right side of the central tendon. So from its name, caval, it means that it transmits the inferior vena cava with the terminal branches of the right phrenic nerve. The esophageal opening, it is more lower down. It's at the level of T10, at the level of the 10th thoracic vertebra. It is within the fibers of the left crus. So esophageal opening, it means that it transmits esophagus with two vagi, right and left one, with esophageal branches that comes from the left gastric vessels in the abdomen, in addition to the lymphatics from the lower third of the esophagus. All these will come through the esophageal opening. The third one is the aortic opening, which is the most lower down opening. It is at the level of T12, the last thoracic vertebra. It is located in between the two crura, two crura, it means right and left crus. It transmits the aorta, thoracic duct, and azygous vein. Actually, in addition to these three main openings, there are another openings, small openings like sympathetic subplanchnic nerves, sympathetic trunk, and the superior epigastric vessels. Also, they run through small openings in the diaphragm. And this is enough for the diaphragm. Next is the chest cavity. So we are done with chest wall. Now let's move to the chest cavity. It is bounded by the chest wall. Chest cavity, of course, is bounded by chest wall, and from below by the diaphragm. So the chest cavity is divided into median partition called the mediastinum. There is a median partition called mediastinum, and lateral to this median partition lying the two pleurae and lungs, right and left lungs, surrounded by their pleurae, right, with their coverings, pleura. Let's start with the mediastinum. It is movable partition, extends superiorly to the thoracic outlet and the root of the neck, inferiorly to the diaphragm. So it extends anteriorly to the sternum and posteriorly to the vertebral column, right? What is there in the mediastinum? It contains the remains of thymus, the heart with surrounding large blood vessels, the trachea, esophagus, thoracic duct, and others. And we will talk about each one. The mediastinum, in order to understand the mediastinum, it will be divided into superior mediastinum and inferior mediastinum. If you look to this slide, you will see that there is an imaginary plane. Imaginary تخيلي هو مو حقيقي. It is an imaginary plane passing from the sternal angle anteriorly to the lower border of the body of T4 posteriorly. Right? So this is an imaginary plane. This will divide the mediastinum into superior one and inferior one. Then the inferior mediastinum, it will be more subdivided into anterior, middle, and posterior mediastinum by presence of heart with its surrounding pericardium. Inferior mediastinum is more subdivided into middle mediastinum. Middle, it is the site of the heart with its surrounding pericardium. Anterior mediastinum, it means anteriorly, it extends anteriorly between the pericardium and the sternum. The posterior mediastinum that lies posterior to the pericardium. It extends between the pericardium and the vertebral column. So, the superior mediastinum, as we said, it is bounded in front by the manubrium sterni and behind by the upper four thoracic vertebrae. So what are the structures that comes in order in the superior mediastinum بالترتيب بالتسلسل from front to posterior, from anteriorly to posteriorly? First is thymus, large veins, large arteries, trachea, esophagus, and thoracic duct. Finally, the sympathetic trunk. This is in the superior mediastinum. What about the inferior mediastinum? What are the structures that run in the inferior mediastinum in order from anterior to posterior? First is thymus, then heart within the pericardium, and two phrenic nerves on the sides, then the esophagus and thoracic duct, then descending aorta, finally the sympathetic trunk. So the inferior mediastinum, it is bounded anteriorly by the body of the sternum, posteriorly by the lower 8 thoracic vertebrae. What are the structures that are located, the contents of the mediastinum? What are the structures that are located in the mediastinum? We will talk about this one by one. First is the thymus gland. As you know, it is a flattened bilobed gland. It plays, as you know, very important role in the immune system, especially in the first 2 years of life. It is well developed and active in children. It's considered as the factory of the T cell, responsible for development of T cell, the maturation of T cell, the differentiation, and they acquire the immune competent process, and all the functions of the T cell will be acquired and completed in the thymus gland, which, as I said, considered as a factory for T cell. So it plays a very important role. It is in the mediastinum. It's located in the mediastinum and may extend to the superior. It is in the inferior but may extend to the superior. It is pink, lobulated, and supplied by inferior thyroid artery and internal thoracic artery. This is for thymus gland. The second structure is the trachea. If you look to this slide, the trachea, it is a mobile structure, a tube. It is a tube located in the midline. It consists of cartilaginous part and membranous part. It begins in the neck. It is the continuation of the larynx at the lower border of the cricoid cartilage at level of C6. So it is continuation of the larynx. It start at this level, but it ends at the level of carina, as you see here. Carina, here in this region, it is at the level of the sternal angle, opposite T4, T5, in which it will be divided into right principal bronchus and left principal bronchus. The length of the trachea is 11.25 centimeter in length, of course, for adults, not in children. And it's about 2.5 centimeter in diameter for in diameter. So يعني لسهولة الحفظ خلينا نقول 1 inch. Let's say 1 inch in diameter. The wall of the trachea is reinforced by C-shaped cartilaginous rings, أو الناس تقول U-shaped cartilaginous rings or C-shaped that open posteriorly. طبعا of course it is not open, but it is closed by muscle. بس أقصد إنه open posteriorly إنه هي not يعني complete rings, they are incomplete rings or C-shaped cartilaginous rings أو U-shape يعني all are correct. It is closed posteriorly by trachealis muscle. So this to keep the patency, to ensure the patency of the tube. حتى لا ينسد، إلا ممكن ينسد مثلا أو blocked for any reason. بس وجود ال C-shaped cartilaginous rings هيتحافظ على ال patency of the tube. What are the relations of the trachea? إذا نجي للrelation of the trachea anteriorly، خلينا نبدأ. Anteriorly it is related, as you know, to the back of the sternum, thymus gland, left brachiocephalic vein, then the origin of the brachiocephalic artery or left common carotid arteries that comes from the arch of aorta and the arch of aorta. This is anterior. Posteriorly, there is esophagus posterior to trachea, and there is a groove between the trachea and esophagus posteriorly. In this groove running the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. So posteriorly it relates to the esophagus and the groove that transmit the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. To the right side there is the zygous vein, right vagus artery, right vagus nerve and the pleura. While on the left side the arch, left common carotid, left subclavian, left vagus, left phrenic, and finally the pleura. What is the blood supply of the trachea? From where? The upper 2/3 is different from the lower third of the trachea. So the upper 2/3 has different blood supply from the lower third of the trachea. The upper 2/3 is supplied by inferior thyroid arteries, while the lower third is supplied by the bronchial arteries. So the upper 2/3 is different from the lower third. What about the lymphatic drainage of the trachea? As this slide shows, they drains into pretracheal lymph node, then paratracheal lymph node, and finally they ends into the deep cervical lymph node. Pretracheal, then paratracheal, then to the deep cervical lymph node. What about the nerve supply of the trachea? The sensory innervation from the trachea is always from the vagi and recurrent laryngeal nerves, while the sympathetic innervation is only for trachealis muscle, right? So it's sensation to vagi and recurrent laryngeal. The autonomic innervation is to the trachealis muscle. And thank you for your listening.